parents ignored my elder sister's brutal bullying for years, so I finally moved out at 18.6 years. My parents ignored my elder sister's brutal bullying for years, so I finally moved out when I turned 18. It was my only way to find peace and escape the constant torment. 6 years later, out of the blue, they reached out to me, claiming they wanted to reconcile. But their efforts blew up in their faces for reasons they probably never expected. My older sister, Rose, had been a massive bully throughout my life, and honestly, living with her was one of the most painful and difficult experiences I have ever endured. To give you a clearer picture, Rose had ADHD. Her constant hyperactivity, paired with her aggressive and unpredictable nature, made her an extremely challenging person to share a home with, especially as kids. I was born when Rose was 5 years old, and from the moment I arrived, her reaction to having a younger sibling in the house was anything but warm or welcoming. She struggled with the attention I naturally received as a baby, and I guess that was the starting point of her resentment toward me. Now, I know it is normal for older siblings to feel a bit jealous or displaced when a new baby comes along, but Rose's feelings went far beyond that. She would throw full-blown tantrums whenever my parents spent time with me, as if my mere existence was an insult to her. Birthdays, which should have been joyous occasions for me as a kid, turned into chaotic disasters. Rose would scream, cry, and create such dramatic scenes that my special day would be completely overshadowed. Instead of feeling celebrated, I often felt embarrassed and humiliated because of her outbursts. As I got older, her behavior shifted from being general chaos to something far more targeted and malicious. She began to physically lash out at me. Sometimes she would push me unnecessarily, other times she would bite me, and both actions felt deliberate. It was not just sibling roughhousing, it felt calculated, like she genuinely wanted to hurt me. By then, it was clear to me that her resentment was not a phase. She truly seemed to hate me for existing and disrupting the dynamic she had with our parents before I came along. One of the hardest parts about growing up with Rose was her lack of friendships. She never had friends, and my parents, in their endless quest to make her feel included, would drag me along to playdates or group activities where her behavior would inevitably cause tension. Fun outings were rare for me because they were always overshadowed by her inability to interact appropriately with others. I spent so much of my childhood mediating conflicts, apologizing on her behalf, or trying to fix situations she created. It was exhausting. By the time I hit my teen years, my resentment toward her had grown into something I could barely contain. I longed for the kind of sibling relationship my friends seemed to have. One where your older sister was someone you could look up to and rely on for protection. Instead, I had Rose, who made me feel unwanted and alone. What made it even worse was how my parents handled it, or rather, how they failed to handle it. They absolutely adored Rose and treated her as if she could do no wrong. Anytime I tried to express how her actions affected me, they would brush it off or dismiss it entirely. They would say things like, "Rose is a special kid and she needs your understanding and patience." It felt like they were asking me to sacrifice my happiness, my needs, and even my sense of self, all to accommodate her moods and meltdowns. I was the younger sibling, yet somehow, I was expected to be the mature one. One incident that still stings to this day happened when I turned 13. I had spent weeks begging my parents to take me on a special trip, just the three of us. After much pleading and negotiating, they finally agreed. It was supposed to be my chance to have their undivided attention for once, to feel like I mattered as much as Rose did. But of course, things did not go as planned. When Rose found out about the trip, she completely lost it. She cried inconsolably for hours, screamed at my parents, threw things around the house, and even got in my face, yelling that she would kill me for trying to steal our parents away from her. Her anger was so intense that it genuinely scared me. My parents, instead of standing up for me or enforcing the boundaries they had set, caved under the pressure. They came to me, pleading with me to let Rose come along. They claimed it was the only way to calm her down and avoid further chaos. I tried to resist. I knew deep down that if she came, the trip I had been dreaming of would be ruined. But after hours of their begging and Rose's relentless meltdowns, I gave in. Sure enough, the trip turned into yet another disaster, just like I had predicted. But with Rose raging uncontrollably and my parents' desperate attempt to calm her down, I felt I had no choice but to give in. Once again, her behavior dictated the outcome, and I was left to accommodate her needs like I always had to. It was as if her tantrums were an unstoppable force, and no matter how much I wanted to stand my ground, the weight of her emotional outbursts and my parents' pleading eyes pushed me into compliance. As I feared, bringing Rose along turned the trip into another disaster. From the moment we arrived at Disneyland, things started going south. While I was brimming with excitement, hoping for the magical experience I had dreamed of for weeks, Rose refused to enjoy anything the way other kids seemed to. She flat out refused to get on any of the rides, no matter how much coaxing or gentle persuasion my parents tried. Instead, she clung to my mother like her life depended on it, refusing to let go even for a moment. Every ride we passed, every line we stood in, was met with her loud protests and complaints. She constantly moaned about the crowds, claiming they were too overwhelming, and declared over and over again how much she hated everything about the place. Her screams and cries quickly became the center of attention, and not in a good way. People would stop and stare, their amused smiles turning into awkward glances as Rose's meltdown escalated. The excitement I had been holding on to for so long was drowned out in a sea of her wails and angry outbursts. Within just 2 hours of being there, Rose was begging my parents to take her back to the hotel. What was supposed to be a magical day turned into a complete unraveling of the plans I had been so excited about. In the end, my parents had no choice but to split up to make the situation even remotely manageable. My mother, exhausted and at her wits' end, drove Rose back to the hotel while my dad stayed behind with me. I appreciated my dad's effort to salvage what was left of the day, but the truth was, the damage was already done. Instead of the joyful and carefree celebration I had imagined, my birthday became yet another chapter in the saga of Rose's tantrums taking precedence over everything else. It was a painful reminder of how, no matter what, her needs and emotions always came first. I know my parents truly did their best with the cards they were dealt, but it was impossible not to feel invisible. Rose demanded their attention every hour of every day, and no matter what I did, I was always an afterthought. By the time I turned 17, I had reached my breaking point. Years of dealing with Rose's bullying and my parents' constant ignorance of my own needs had pushed me to the edge. I started dreaming of freedom, of finally living a life where I wasn't overshadowed by my sister's needs or weighed down by my parents' expectations. I began applying to colleges, deliberately focusing on ones as far away from home as possible. When my parents found out about my plans, they were furious. They couldn't understand, or maybe refused to understand, why I felt the need to leave. They begged me to reconsider, insisting that Rose needed me. They reminded me that I was her sibling and had a responsibility to be there for her. But I pushed back. I told them, as calmly as I could, that I simply didn't care about Rose in the way they expected me to. No matter how much they tried to guilt me, I was determined to move forward with my plans. That's when they revealed the real reason they were so against me leaving. After their retirement, they planned to travel and enjoy their lives. But to do that, they needed someone to take over full-time responsibility for Rose, and that someone was supposed to be me. They explained how they had been sacrificing their lives for years, always putting Rose first, so that eventually it would be my turn to step up. I was stunned. Not once had they consulted me about this plan. Not once had they even asked if I would be willing to take on such a massive responsibility. And why would they assume I'd want to? I wasn't her parent. It wasn't my job to care for her. And it felt deeply unfair and unreasonable for them to expect that from me. I expressed my feelings as clearly as I could. I suggested alternatives, like hiring a full-time caretaker or finding ways to help Rose become more independent, at least for a few days at a time. My mom immediately shut those ideas down, insisting that Rose would never be comfortable with a caretaker and needed round-the-clock supervision, which could only be done by a family member, meaning me. My dad agreed with her, even going as far as to call me selfish for refusing their plan. Their comments cut me deeply. But the worst part came next. My dad, in a moment of misplaced honesty, revealed the truth. The only reason they had me, their second child, was so that I could grow up and take care of Rose. I froze. The weight of that revelation hit me harder than I expected. My mind struggled to process it as I sat there, the air suddenly feeling heavier. I stared at my parents in silence, my eyes wide with disbelief, while my mom immediately jumped in, trying to do damage control. She scolded my dad for saying something so insensitive and demanded he apologize for revealing such a thing. Then, in a panicked attempt to smooth things over, she insisted that he didn't really mean it. Of course, she assured me they loved me too. But her words felt hollow, like she was reciting a line she barely believed herself. The damage had already been done. I could not unhear what my dad had said, no matter how much she tried to spin it. In that moment, the puzzle pieces of my life clicked together, and I finally understood why I had always felt like a shadow in my own family. My existence was not seen as its own unique story, but as a solution, a caretaker for Rose, my older sister. It was devastating to realize that my life had been framed around her needs rather than my own aspirations. My mom kept pressing the point, as though she could justify it. "Rose needs help," she said, her voice sharp with exasperation. "And as part of this family, you have a duty to her. We all do." She then pivoted, trying to convince me that my plans for the future were impractical anyway. "Going to college far away is a waste of time and money," she argued. "You'll save so much by staying here. You won't have to pay for rent or food if you just live at home." I wanted to scream. I understood that Rose had her struggles. I wasn't heartless. But did that mean I had to sacrifice my future entirely? Did I have to forfeit my dreams simply because she existed? The thought suffocated me, crushing my spirit under a mountain of guilt and expectations. But I knew arguing would be pointless. My parents were unyielding, and no amount of reasoning would change their minds. Instead, I turned inward, quietly solidifying my resolve. If they refused to support me, I would do it alone. I poured all my energy into my college applications, ignoring their pleas and guilt trips. It was exhausting, but I pushed through because I had no other choice. When I finally received my acceptance letter from a college far enough away to feel like freedom, I allowed myself a moment of triumph. But that joy was short-lived. When I shared the news, my parents were furious. They refused to let me go, throwing every guilt-inducing argument they could think of at me. They said I was selfish, ungrateful, and abandoning my family. Then came the threats. They would cut me off financially, they warned, leaving me entirely on my own if I dared to leave. It was terrifying, but their reaction only strengthened my determination. Desperate, I turned to my grandparents for help. I called them in tears, explaining the situation and begging for their support. My grandmother, a constant source of love and stability in my chaotic life, didn't hesitate. She showed up the very next day, helping me pack my things and gather all the necessary documents. She and my grandfather offered me a place to stay until it was time to leave for college. Their kindness was a lifeline. Of course, my parents didn't stop there. They doubled down, trying to make me feel like I was betraying them. But by then, I was beyond their reach. Even when they told me I would be completely alone and that they would sever ties, I refused to back down. I took out student loans to fund my education and gratefully accepted help from my grandfather, who used part of his hard-earned retirement savings to cover some of my expenses. It broke my heart to accept his money, knowing how much he and my grandmother had sacrificed for their future. They were doing what my parents should have been doing, offering unconditional love and support. The next 4 years were some of the hardest of my life. College was an uphill battle, not just academically, but emotionally. Most of my classmates had parents who visited them, sent care packages, or helped with tuition. I had none of that. I spent almost every day either studying or working, balancing long shifts as a server with the relentless demands of my coursework. There was no room for parties or spontaneous adventures. Every minute of my time was accounted for. Through it all, my parents remained silent. They never called, never texted, never reached out to see if I was okay. The absence of their support was deafening, a void that gnawed at me during my lowest moments. There were nights when I lay awake questioning my worth. wondering if I truly deserved to be abandoned by the very people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. But even in those moments, I refused to give up. I told myself that as long as I kept moving forward, I would eventually build a life of my own. After graduation, that perseverance finally paid off. I landed an incredible job, one that felt like the reward for years of sacrifice and struggle. With that job, I began paying off my student loans and, more importantly, repaying my grandfather. He had never expected me to return the money. He had given it freely, out of love. But to me, it was more than a debt. It was a symbol of everything he and my grandmother had done to help me succeed when no one else would. Looking back, I sometimes wonder how different my life could have been if my parents had been supportive. But then I remind myself that their neglect did not define me. My success is my own, and every step I took to get here only proved how strong I could be. If nothing else, their absence taught me to value the people who truly cared, the ones who stood by me when I needed them the most. It mattered deeply to me to ease his burden, to show him that his faith in me had not been misplaced. That need to prove myself became my guiding force, and it shaped my life in ways I can't even begin to describe. Over time, I've managed to build a close, loving relationship with my grandparents, who have been unwavering in their support. Whenever I get the chance, I book tickets for them to visit me, making sure they know how much I appreciate everything they've done for me. Their kindness and love have been a constant in my life, a source of strength I've leaned on more times than I can count. This year, though, conversations with my grandparents started taking an unsettling turn. They began sharing troubling stories about my sister, Rose. Apparently, her behavior had escalated over the years, growing worse in ways I never could have predicted. Since I was no longer her target, it seemed she'd turned her attention to other people. And not just any people. She'd started bullying neighborhood kids in her area. According to my grandparents, Rose had been throwing water at kids whenever they played outside, screaming at them that they weren't allowed to play near her house. The kids, understandably terrified, stopped going outside altogether. Their parents, however, were livid. They'd complained to my parents several times, pleading with them to do something about Rose's behavior. But in typical fashion, my parents shrugged it off, assuming Rose would get bored and stop on her own. Of course, she didn't. Things escalated when one of the parents, fed up with Rose's constant harassment, called the police. When the officers arrived, they caught Rose in the act, throwing water at a child and screaming at her to run for her life. She was arrested on the spot for harassing minors. My parents, predictably, were furious, not at Rose, but at the police. They argued with the officers, claiming the situation was being blown out of proportion. The police, however, weren't having it. They scolded my parents for failing to keep Rose in check, warning them about the consequences of enabling her behavior. While the news shocked some members of the family, I wasn't surprised at all. I had seen this coming for years. My parents' refusal to hold Rose accountable had only fueled her sense of entitlement and disregard for others. It was inevitable that things would come to this point. Still, hearing about Rose being arrested felt surreal, a stark reminder of just how far things had spiraled. My parents bailed her out, but now she's facing an upcoming court case. And here's where things took an unexpected turn. This week, after 6 years of complete silence, my parents called me. Seeing their number pop up on my phone was surreal, like a ghost from a past life suddenly reappearing. I debated ignoring the call, but curiosity got the better of me. When I answered, my dad's voice was hesitant, almost sheepish. He told me that he and my mom were at their wits' end dealing with Rose. He said they wanted to reconcile with me, claiming they'd missed me all these years but had been too angry and stubborn to reach out. It was like he was trying to rewrite history, brushing over years of abandonment with a half-hearted apology. I wasn't buying it. I could tell they had an agenda, so I cut to the chase and asked them to get to the point. That's when my dad admitted, reluctantly, that they were finally beginning to see the truth about Rose. He said they now realized I'd been right all along. Rose was a bully. She had been getting into more and more trouble since I left, and her behavior had reached a breaking point. My dad even admitted they should have listened to me when I was younger. He said they felt sorry for everything I'd been through and wanted to make things right. They were finally willing to send Rose to therapy, acknowledging that she needed professional help. Hearing those words felt surreal. I had spent so much of my childhood begging them to take action, only to be dismissed or told to understand Rose's behavior. My dad said they wanted to meet with me in person to apologize properly. He seemed to genuinely believe that an apology and a promise to do better were enough to fix everything. But for me, it was too little, too late. I told him, as calmly as I could, that while I was glad they were finally giving Rose the help she needed, I just didn't care anymore. Too much time had passed. They hadn't bothered to contact me for 6 years. Over that time, I had come to terms with their absence and built a life that didn't include them. I wasn't willing to let them back in now, not after everything that had happened. My dad tried to push back, urging me to reconsider. He said they needed me, that the family wasn't whole without me. But I stood my ground. After years of being treated like an afterthought, I wasn't going to let them guilt me into reconciliation just because they needed something from me now. So here I am wondering, am I the asshole for refusing to reconcile with my family after everything they've put me through? Update 1. I want to clarify a few things because honestly, I cannot reply to everyone in the comments. For those asking, no, my sister was never bullied. That was not a factor here. She attended a specialized school specifically designed for children with needs like hers. It was a very small, closely monitored environment, almost like a bubble. The school had strict policies and only admitted a handful of special needs students, ensuring each one got proper attention. There was constant supervision throughout the day, so the idea of her being bullied there just does not add up. Her teachers were amazing, genuinely invested in her well-being, and my parents were super involved. They checked in regularly, made sure everything was going smoothly, and were always on top of things regarding her education. So, no, her issues were not because of bullying or anything external like that. The reality is much harder to accept. It was about how she was allowed to behave at home. She was mean to me constantly. I mean, constantly. If she bit me, slapped me, or shoved me, there were absolutely no consequences for her. None. On the other hand, I was always expected to be the understanding one. If she lashed out, it was somehow my job to stay calm, pacify her, and just take it. My parents would always say things like, "She doesn't know better," or "You're older, you have to understand." But that only made me feel like I did not matter, like my feelings and experiences were secondary to hers. Some of you also asked why Rose was never sent to therapy. The simple answer is that therapy was, and still is, too expensive. My parents could never afford it, so it was not even an option on the table. On top of that, my mom has always had this very possessive attitude toward Rose. She believed that no one, not even professionals, could understand Rose's needs better than she could. So she never allowed Rose to spend much time with anyone else. It was like she had this mom knows best mentality and refused to let go of control. As a result, Rose grew up being completely dependent on her. My mom makes all the decisions for her, even now. It is like Rose cannot think for herself because she has never had to. Now, after reading through all the comments under my post, it is pretty clear to me why my parents are suddenly trying to reach out after all this time. The reason is not some heartfelt desire to reconnect or make amends. It is obvious they need my help with Rose's upcoming case. I am almost certain they want me to offer a character reference for her if it comes to that. Or maybe they are hoping I can chip in financially to cover the lawyer's fees since I earn a good income now, and they probably know that. But here is the thing. I cannot ignore the timing. After all these years of silence, it is not about fixing things with me. It feels like they are desperate and trying to find someone who can help them clean up the mess they let happen. They probably assume I will step in, be the good son, and save the day. Well, I am not doing that. I spent years being expected to put my feelings aside for the sake of Rose. I am not about to do it again, especially not when it is clear that their motivations are less about me and more about what I can do for them. Update 2. For everyone asking how my grandparents feel about my parents suddenly wanting to reconnect with me, let me just say, it's complicated. To be honest, my grandparents are not exactly thrilled about the whole thing. Over the years, their relationship with my parents has been, let's just say, distant at best. They never fully got over everything that went down when I was kicked out. Back then, when I was fighting tooth and nail to go to college, My parents made it clear that they had other priorities. My grandparents stepped in and supported me when no one else did, and that definitely drove a wedge between them and my parents. Since then, things have been tense. My grandparents have mostly kept their distance from my parents unless absolutely necessary. The only reason they even talk to them these days is because of my younger sibling, who I'll just refer to as Rose. Not her real name, obviously. Rose can be a handful. My parents occasionally lean on my grandparents to help with her, whether it's babysitting or stepping in when things get overwhelming. Honestly, my grandparents know exactly what Rose is like. They've seen it all firsthand. Her bullying, her nasty attitude, the way she acts like the world owes her something. They're not blind to it, and they've never excused her behavior. If anything, they're disappointed in how my parents have handled her over the years. They've told me as much. Here's the thing. My grandparents have always been in my corner. They've supported me through thick and thin, even when it put them in a tough spot with my parents. So now that my parents are suddenly eager to mend fences and play happy family, my grandparents are understandably skeptical. They've made it very clear that they get why I'm hesitant. They've seen how much my parents' actions, or lack thereof, have hurt me, and they don't want me to rush into anything that could leave me feeling worse. They've actually sat me down and told me to be careful. They've said, "Look, we know you've been through a lot, and we don't want you to get hurt again. Take your time. Don't let them pressure you into anything you're not ready for." And honestly, I appreciate that. It feels good to have someone in my corner who sees the situation for what it is. That being said, my parents are not letting up. This week alone, I've received several messages from them. They're practically begging me to give them another chance. They keep saying how sorry they are for the way things turned out, how they regret their actions or inactions, and how they want to make things right. They've been laying it on thick, emphasizing how much they've grown and realized their mistakes. I don't even know how to respond at this point. The truth is, I feel torn. Part of me wants to believe them, to give them the benefit of the doubt. But another part of me remembers all too clearly what it felt like to be abandoned when I needed them the most. I can't help but wonder if this is just another cycle, empty promises followed by disappointment. It's exhausting to even think about. So yeah, that's where I'm at right now. Stuck between wanting to believe people can change and protecting myself from more heartbreak. It's a lot to process, and honestly, I have no idea what I'm going to do next. Update 3. Okay, so my suspicions about my parents turned out to be true, and honestly, I don't know how to feel about it. After weeks of them pestering me, I finally agreed to a video call. I wasn't exactly jumping at the opportunity to see them again after all this time, but a part of me felt like it was the right thing to do. The days leading up to the call were a mix of nerves, dread, and curiosity. Like opening a letter you know contains bad news, but you can't help but read anyway. When the screen flickered to life and their faces appeared, I froze. They looked so different, older, tired, worn out in a way that made my chest ache. It hit me harder than I expected. These were the same people who used to seem invincible to me as a kid, and now they just looked defeated. I tried to keep my emotions in check, masking the wave of guilt and sadness with polite smiles and nods as we eased into the conversation. We started with the usual small talk, how they've been, what's new in their lives, the kind of surface-level chit-chat that felt almost absurd given the years of distance between us. I told them a bit about my work and updated them on the family, filling in the gaps about my grandparents. For a brief moment, it felt oddly normal, like we were a family again, like no time had passed. But then came the apologies. My parents apologized, again. They said they regretted how distant they had been and how they wished they could have done things differently. They sounded almost desperate, like they were clinging to some hope that I could forgive them. And then they dropped the bombshell, the reason they had been so insistent about reconnecting. They needed money. More specifically, they needed financial help to take care of my sister Rose. My dad admitted they had burned through almost all their savings on Rose's medical treatments over the years, and now with her legal case looming and the therapy she would need afterward, they were drowning under the weight of it all. He said it plainly, almost pleadingly. Could I send them money every month? My mom jumped in quickly to emphasize that every cent would go toward Rose, nothing else. I felt my stomach churn. My hands clenched in my lap as I tried to process what I was hearing. They wanted me to save her, the same person who had made my childhood a living nightmare. I couldn't hold it in anymore. Do you seriously think I'd send my hard-earned money to help Rose? My voice was trembling, frustration boiling to the surface. After everything she's done to me? She bullied me for years. She ruined every single birthday I ever had. She made me feel like I didn't belong in my own home. And now you expect me to just forget all of that and help her? The words poured out of me, years of bottled-up anger and hurt spilling over. I reminded them of how they had failed to protect me from Rose, how they had always expected me to just endure her cruelty and keep quiet. They never stepped in when she crossed the line. Instead, they brushed it off, told me to be patient with her because of her ADHD, as if that excused everything. I told them flat out, Rose's ADHD didn't mean she shouldn't be held accountable for her actions. It didn't give her a free pass to treat me the way she did. And now, as an adult, she was facing the consequences of years of unchecked behavior, getting arrested for harassing kids, no less. And somehow, they still wanted me to step in and save her, as if I wasn't her first victim. My dad tried to argue, his voice trembling with emotion, but I cut him off. If you had gotten her the help she needed when she was younger, maybe things wouldn't have turned out like this. Maybe she wouldn't have turned into someone who hurt everyone around her. I wasn't done. And where were you when I needed you? When I was away at college, struggling on my own, did you ever check in on me? No. But now that you need something, suddenly you're here, acting like the concerned parents? The silence on the other end of the call was deafening. My mom finally spoke, her voice softer now, almost pleading. She said they couldn't change the past, but they wanted to try to make things right moving forward. They didn't want to lose me, even if I couldn't help financially. She admitted they had made mistakes and said they just wanted to rebuild our relationship, no matter how long it took. I didn't know what to say. On one hand, I wanted to believe them. I wanted to believe that they genuinely wanted to reconnect, that this wasn't just about money. But on the other hand, the pain was still there, raw and unrelenting. I told them I needed time to think. As I ended the call, I felt a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and maybe even a flicker of hope. But mostly, I just felt exhausted. Exhausted from carrying the weight of the past, from having to confront it all over again, and from the realization that some wounds don't heal as easily as we'd like to believe. Update 4. Sorry for the delay. It's been over a month since my last update, and things have been complicated, to say the least. To start with, my sister Rose has been ordered by the court to attend mandatory counseling. I suppose it is a step in the right direction, though I have my doubts about how effective it will be. Knowing her, I wonder if she'll take it seriously or just go through the motions to check off a box. Still, it's something, and I'm trying to take that as a positive sign. As for my parents, they ended up having to pay a hefty fine because of what Rose did to harass those kids. Honestly, when the whole mess blew up, I expected my sister's punishment to be much harsher. I thought there might be some kind of jail time, or at least more serious consequences, but I guess the judge decided to show her some leniency since this was her first official offense. Not that I think it was warranted. What she did was vile and inexcusable. But the system is what it is. Maybe they're hoping the counseling will help her turn a corner. I guess we'll see. On top of that, some of the parents of the kids Rose harassed have taken out restraining orders against her. This means she's now legally required to stay far, far away from all their children. If she violates those orders, she'll be arrested immediately. The thought of her being forced to face real consequences for her actions is oddly satisfying. It's a small relief to know that those families now have some protection, even if it feels like too little too late. Now, when it comes to my parents, things have been civil, I guess. Since the day I made it clear that I would not be offering them any financial help, they haven't brought up the subject again. Not once. It's almost surreal. I half expected them to try to guilt-trip me or manipulate me like they used to, but instead, our conversations have been limited to small, trivial things. It's a strange dynamic. We talk, but only about surface-level topics, like the weather or what they've been watching on TV. It feels like they're tiptoeing around me, and maybe they are. Maybe they realize that if they push too hard, they'll lose what little connection we have left. As much as I appreciate their effort to keep things peaceful, I'm not ready to dive back into a full-on relationship with my family. That bridge was burned a long time ago, and even if they're trying to rebuild it, I don't think I'm ready to cross it, especially not with Rose. Honestly, I don't think I'll ever forgive her, no matter how much time passes or how much therapy she goes through. The things she did to me, the years of bullying, the constant torment, the way she made my life a living hell, aren't things that can just be swept under the rug. Those scars run too deep. I hope the counseling forces her to face what she's done, to really hold herself accountable for her actions. But if I'm being completely honest, I'm not holding my breath. Change like that doesn't happen overnight, and with someone like Rose, I'm not even sure it'll happen at all. Only time will tell. For now, I'm focusing on myself and trying to move forward, even if my family is stuck in the past.